From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Caitlin Lyons. Donald Trump and Kamala Harris crisscrossed the Sun Belt with just 5 days to go until the election, and Trump already sowing doubt on the outcome of the vote. We'll have more this hour with Elizabeth Wydra of the Constitutional Accountability Center and our political panel, Alvin Jordan and Maura Gillespie. Plus, as the economy remains in focus for voters casting their ballots, new data shows both inflation and spending picking up ahead of tomorrow's jobs report. And we begin with more on that from the North Lawn of the White House, where National Economic Council Director Lael Brainard is joining us. Director Brainard, thank you so much for being here with us on Bloomberg. There's a few ways you could look at this data, one being at 2.1% year over year on headline PCE. We are almost back at the Fed's target. The other would be on the monthly basis of core PCE. It's the biggest jump we've seen since April. So how far away are you from declaring victory?
Look, I think if you look back, it wasn't too long ago that people were saying there's no way we could get to the kind of inflation print that we saw today without a recession. And yet here we are. We've got PCE inflation at 2.1%. Just a tad above the target at a time where we just learned that the economy grew close to 3% and unemployment is down around 4.1%. So that is a very good trajectory for the U.S. economy, very sustainable. And, you know, we got some additional data on things like compensation. You put that together with very strong productivity, 2.7% over the last year, suggests that we're on a very sustainable trajectory with moderate inflation back close to target.
Well, and we'll get more on wages specifically tomorrow when we get the jobs report, Director. What would be a concerning jobs figure for this administration tomorrow? It is expected to show a slowdown, but how much are you bracing for?
You know, of course, we expect data to be noisy. Recall we had devastating hurricanes during the month of October, Hurricanes Milton and Helene. We had a large number of workers out on strike. So the data, we expect there to be some noise there. But again, you know, if you look at the underlying trend, growth has been very strong, close to 3%. And we've had the lowest average unemployment rate of any administration. People have benefited from incomes being $4,000 higher than before the pandemic, even after accounting for prices. And as you saw just today, consumers are resilient and continuing to spend.
Well, this administration, of course, only has a few months left. And if you look at the data in totality that we've gotten in these last few weeks, what is it telling you about the kind of economy the next president is going to be inheriting in January?
So I think we saw a really good article on that today in the Wall Street Journal, saying that the next president will inherit a very strong economy, an economy where business investment is really bolstering growth. And of course, that reflects the investment, historic investment incentives in clean energy, semiconductors, infrastructure, but also consumers that are very resilient. Consumers, as we've seen, that have been able to spend more, but also have saved more. And if you look at the job market over the course of the administration, we've really seen people moving into better paying jobs, more productive jobs, and that 2.7% productivity growth over the last year, that really bodes well for continued trajectory of strong growth, low inflation.
Well, as we consider the risks that are out there, though, just today we saw another spike in oil futures. Oil, of course, has been incredibly volatile given what's happening in the Middle East. There was a report from Axios that Iranian proxies may be preparing another attempted attack on Israel. And I just wonder whether it's what's happening in the oil markets or other areas, what risks out there you see to the pretty rosy economic picture you're describing.
So we always monitor oil markets very closely. And of course, have been making sure to rebuild the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And you can see that consumers are seeing prices at the pump that are below $3 per gallon in a large number of states. So we've seen some good improvement on gas prices at the pump, but we're going to continue monitoring those areas because they matter so much to households and their weekly expenditures.
Yeah, we know that the cost of living in the economy overall consistently in polling is shown to be top of voters' minds. Often what comes second after the economy, Director, is the border. And we're, of course, hearing a lot of rhetoric surrounding the border and migration on the campaign trail, including ideas presented specifically by Donald Trump around mass deportation, or increasingly we're learning about his plans for lowering legal immigration as well. And I just wonder what impact you think the kind of things he is talking about could have on the economy, on the supply of workers, what it would do to growth, for example. What does it realistically look like?
Yeah, so I think more broadly, there are competing visions out there. We've got congressional Republicans, some that are proposing a combination of things. And of course, if you have the kinds of across-the-board sweeping tariffs that are being proposed, that really risks sending the economy back into the kind of supply chain disruptions and price spikes and consumer pain that we saw in the pandemic. If you couple that with mass deportations, but also with the kind of very large increases to the debt that are being proposed, that would be quite an inflationary picture. And of course, nobody wants that.
Well, this is actually, as you speak of tariffs, something that Douglas Holtz-Eakin of the American Action Forum raised with us earlier today here on Bloomberg TV. This is what he had to say about some of the policy ideas we are hearing about and what the impact will be.
The economy is not the spooky thing. It's the policy risk that's surrounded. If you're trying to figure out where you're going, it's all about what will the Fed do, and in particular, what will the candidates do, who will win, and how will the Fed have to react to, for example, a 10% across-the-board tariff. That's hard to game that out.
Obviously, some spooky language working its way in on this Halloween, Director, and happy Halloween to you. But if you consider that point, that the fiscal policies put forward by whatever administration it is we get could actually impact monetary policy, should the American voter be bracing themselves for a higher for longer interest rate environment? Just expect that the new baseline is different?
Well, I think what Doug Holtz-Eakin was really referring to was that kind of sweeping tariff proposal. And, the kinds of sweeping tariff proposals that are out there with the kinds of sales tax that would put on American families, a tax of $4,000 per family per year. You couple that with the kinds of disruptions to supply chains that we would see with sweeping tariffs across all countries and across all imports. And yes, I do think that we are seeing concerns about a return to an inflationary environment from those kinds of sweeping proposals to raise prices across the board.
Well, and of course, a lot of those proposals are directed at China, and there are still tariffs in place during this administration. It's not just tariffs, though, when we consider the restraint around China. It's also things like export controls we have seen this administration putting into place around strategic technology, including artificial intelligence. And that's, of course, an area I know you at the National Economic Council have been focused on. You had last month, for example, a roundtable on leadership and AI infrastructure, including the likes of Sam Altman. And I just wonder what realistically the administration is looking at there in these final months.
Yeah, so the president issued a national security memorandum which really concluded that maintaining America's preeminence on frontier models in artificial intelligence is vital to our national security. And in order for us to retain that kind of preeminence, which has been driven by the private sector, we need to make sure that we have leading edge semiconductors manufactured here in the U.S., and that's what the CHIPS and Science Act has been about. We now have commitments from all the leading edge semiconductor companies to manufacture here in the U.S. But the other thing that's very important is compute power. And so we need to continue to work with the private sector on making sure there's enough clean energy added to our grid to be able to have the kinds of data centers that are necessary for frontier AI models. So we're going to keep working with the private sector, and of course hope that the next administration, will continue to emphasize those investments in clean energy, in advanced manufacturing. Of course, that's something the Vice President cares deeply about as well.
All right, Lael Brainard, Director of the National Economic Council, joining us from the White House North Lawn this evening. Thank you so much. And while we consider the future of economic policy here in the U.S., we've also gotten some fiscal policy news out of the U.K. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, unveiling a new budget with £40 billion of tax hikes and ramped up borrowing. She discussed it with Bloomberg TV earlier today.
That budget wipes the slate clean so that we never have to do a budget like this again. We are cleaning up the mess left by the previous government, but we are meeting our fiscal rules 2 years early. We've set the spending path for public services for the course of this Parliament. We will do a zero-based review to make sure we're getting value for money for that spending. We have had to make tax increases, but that is to get our public finances on a sustainable footing.
You can find the full interview of the Chancellor on the terminal and online. Still ahead, final steps on the campaign trail with just 5 days to go until Election Day. Our Bloomberg reporter panel is next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I want to protect the women of our country. I want to protect the women. Sir, please don't say that. Why? They said we think it's very inappropriate for you to say. So why? I'm president. I want to protect the women of our country. I said, well, I'm going to do it whether the women like it or not. I'm going to protect them.
Donald Trump drawing fire today for those comments made last night at a rally in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Vice President Harris wasting no time in responding earlier.
It actually is, I think, very offensive to women in terms of not understanding their agency, their authority, their right and their ability to make decisions about their own lives, including their own bodies. He is not going to be fighting for women's reproductive rights. He does not prioritize the freedom of women and the intelligence of women to make decisions about their own lives and bodies.
Joining me now for more is our Bloomberg signature political panel of Bloomberg reporters. Akayla, Gardner and Gregory Korte are with me around the table here in Washington on Bloomberg TV and radio. So, Akayla, it does feel like in these final days of the campaign, with just 5 days left to go, there's a lot of focus on gender specifically.
Yeah. Pollsters are saying this could be one of the biggest gender gaps in history that we're looking at right now. And you saw Vice President Harris basically going on the attack on Trump today. And this is something that she's been doing almost consistently on the campaign trail day to day, is really having this gaggle where she seeks to draw a contrast with Donald Trump. And today it was, of course, about those remarks about women that they made. And the campaign is saying that right now in early voting data, they're seeing 55% of those voters are women. And they feel very encouraged by that, especially, again, because pollsters are saying more women are breaking for Vice President Harris than Donald Trump.
There still are, of course, though, women who do support Donald Trump. And on the right, there has been a lot of noise made today about comments made by Mark Cuban suggesting that Donald Trump doesn't surround himself with strong, intelligent women. He's had to walk some of that back on Twitter, or at least clarify his remarks. But, Gregory, that's Mark Cuban, a Harris surrogate, who have had to clarify some remarks, just as we've seen President Biden having to do this week with his garbage remark about Trump supporters, either singular or plural. How much damage are the surrogates doing to her here?
Yeah, this has been the story of the week, right? Beginning with the Trump comedian in Madison Square Garden talking about the floating pile of garbage that is the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico. And just extending into now this discussion. This is where we are in the campaign, right? And it's all about providing the sort of what we would call in a sports context the bulletin board material, where if you trash talk your opponent, your coach is going to, the other coach is going to put that on the bulletin board as motivation for his players. And that's what's going on both sides right now, frankly, is that they're taking whatever grist they can use from the other side to motivate their voters, because that's where we are right now. We're beyond persuasion. We're about getting every single last voter on both sides out to the polls and redefining and re-upping the stakes as we get closer to election day.
Well, and especially getting voters out in the battleground states that could decide this thing. They were in Wisconsin last night. Today, they're both in Nevada, Harris in Arizona as well. But Donald Trump also spent time today in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So what's that about?
Well, this is a continuation of a rather quixotic campaign strategy by Trump for a while now. Again, the Madison Square Garden, Lower Manhattan is not a swing state, right? So he's been in California. He's been in Montana. His plan is that, look, in a mass-mediated age, in a social media age, it doesn't matter where you are. People are going to get your message no matter where you are. But it's still an unusual decision, given that, he's one of the people who espouses this theory that the entire reason why, or at least a large part of the reason why Hillary Clinton lost to him in 2016 is that she didn't spend enough time in Wisconsin, which was a key swing state at the time. As we get closer to the election day, the most finite resource that the candidates have is their time. Yeah. And where they choose to spend it could be decisive.
Well, and as I mentioned, choosing to spend it in the Sun Belt today, Akayla, not the most obvious path to victory for Kamala Harris, but obviously areas in which there are a large group of Latino voters. And Jennifer Lopez is going to be joining her in Las Vegas. So is that really the focus, that demographic today?
Well, I think this is really coming off some of those comments that were in Madison Square Garden, where we saw that comedian make some of those offensive comments about Puerto Rico. We've seen the campaign really drilling in on those, or touting those endorsements from J-Lo, from Bad Bunny. And this is really a group that has shown signs of shifting towards Donald Trump. That has been especially concerning, especially Latino men, black men also part of that coalition. So they're certainly trying to double down and also just make sure that they're not losing this group for the long term ahead, for the future Democratic presidential candidates that are to come. Yeah.
Well, that's an excellent point. Finally, as we consider the messaging we're hearing from all sides, what we're hearing from Donald Trump in recent days, focused specifically on Pennsylvania, is already allegations that there's cheating underway or stealing underway. This is 5 days before Election Day, and already it seems like the groundwork is being laid for contesting these results.
Yeah, if we talk about how close this election is, it's within the margin of error in polling. I heard from a Democratic activist today that said it's within the margin of effort. And if you talk to Republican lawyers, they will say it's within the margin of litigation, right? So a lot of what's happening right now is laying the groundwork. Our colleague Zoe Tillman has gone through every single lawsuit she can find, found more than 165 lawsuits that have already been filed in a lot of these swing states, to lay the groundwork for challenges afterwards if the result doesn't go the right way, depending on which side you're on. But with Trump, it's even it goes even a step further, is casting doubt about the integrity of the election process before we've even counted a single vote, and that's a little troubling, and it's sort of a bad omen in terms of how contentious that post-election day atmosphere is going to be a week from now when we're sitting here and possibly still not knowing who the next president of the United States is going to be.
Yeah, it could take days or weeks even. Bloomberg's Akayla Gardner and Gregory Korte, thank you so much for joining. Coming up after the bell, Apple, Amazon, and Intel reported earnings, and we'll have a closer look at those next with Bloomberg Technology's Ed Ludlow on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. A trio of tech powerhouses reported earnings after the bell: Apple, Amazon, and Intel. And joining me now for a closer look at those tech earnings is Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow, co-host of Bloomberg Technology. So, Ed, we've got two up and one down. So let's begin with the laggard, Apple. China is still the problem.
Yeah, I mean, overall, Apple kind of beat on all the metrics you'd expect. Overall revenue, iPhone sales being the most important thing, and it grew in every geography around the world apart from Greater China. This call is underway, and typically we learn through the call about the product or category specific performance. I'm waiting, eyes down on the Bloomberg terminal, to find out, did iPhone grow in China? That's the big question.
Well, certainly it remains a question. It has been for some time, it seems. And then when you look at other companies like Amazon doing pretty well, especially in all segments of their business, the shares are up, 4% after hours?
Yeah, so Amazon is an interesting one because you have both the consumer-facing part of the business, particularly here in America, but the cloud business being probably the most important part. It all comes down to their forecast for the final 3 months of this year, whether it's revenue or operating income, and the cloud business returning to growth. That's the AI story that all investors want to see. Top-line growth in cloud and Amazon having impressive margins.
So if we think about what investors want to see, they've been looking for some good news from Intel for a while, it seems, Ed, and delivered, actually, after the bell. Big pop.
It's fascinating because the big pop is significant. You know, we should point that out. They actually got kind of almost bad news about the quarter gone because Intel did well in areas like data center chips, evidence it did well. PC, where it's dominated for a long time historically, it did not do as well. But it's disclosed significant impairment charges, which were a surprise, disclosed and finalized layoffs. The point is investors are taking that and saying you did the hard, painful stuff to turn around the company. And we see signs that in your forward-looking guidance, you're getting nearer to putting Intel back at the front of the semiconductor industry. We'll get a chance to ask more questions very soon.
Yeah, we're looking forward to your conversation with the CEO, Pat Gelsinger. What does he most need to answer for? What's your biggest question?
So everything is about AI chips, AI accelerators, GPUs. We know all about NVIDIA really owning that space, AMD trying to catch up. Intel's bad news was that their accelerator Gaudi has fallen behind. He said it hasn't got the traction they expected. They won't meet their targets, which were modest, 500 million of sales this year. Why? Why is this not working for you? But there are some other structural things with the company that we just have to ask about as well.
All right, well, you can catch those questions and all the answers in Ed's conversation with Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger. That's coming up on a special edition of Bloomberg Technology right here at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. Good luck in the interview, and thank you so much for joining. But still ahead here, first on Balance of Power, we'll take a closer look at the legal challenges surrounding this election, the cases that are already being fought in court in the days leading up to the vote, and of course the many legal challenges that could come in the aftermath, as we do expect many of these results could be contested. We'll have more with Elizabeth Wydra, president of the Constitutional Accountability Center. She'll join me next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
On the one hand, they say that as Americans say they would accept the results of the race. But if you push them on it, they're very, very worried about the situation post-election. There's a lot of trepidation. There's a lot of worry. There's a lot of belief that the system is not fair, it's rigged, and it's fraudulent. The closer it is, and the longer it takes, the more likely it is for people to not trust the results.
Cliff Young, president of U.S. Public Affairs at Ipsos Polling, on the early edition of Balance of Power today. And joining me now on the late edition here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Elizabeth Wydra, president of the Constitutional Accountability Center. Elizabeth, welcome back to Bloomberg. When you consider just broadly the institutional lack of trust it seems has developed in the American electoral system, the very foundation of this republic, what do you think the authors of the Constitution would be thinking right now about where we've come?
Well, I think they would be shocked and disappointed, frankly. The fact is that we do have free and fair elections here in the United States, and we have the will of the people respected. We saw significant erosion of that when Donald Trump refused to accept the results of the 2020 election, rejecting the will of the people, which is something that, I think the founders definitely would be afraid of, that could recur. We're already seeing the playbook from 2020 come back already in this cycle. Before the election, after the 2020 election, we saw all of these lawsuits by the Trump campaign, alleging irregularities. They all went nowhere, even in front of Trump-appointed judges. And so there are absolutely no credible claims that anyone other than eligible voters are the ones who are voting. And when there are these extraordinarily rare instances where someone else tries to vote who isn't eligible, the system works and stops that. So we're seeing this doubt cast, but the reality is that democracy works when we respect the will of the people and respect the hardworking election and poll workers who help to make it work.
I do want to get into the legal challenges we could see after the election, but we've already seen a number of them borne out and news on them in just recent days. Elizabeth, yesterday, for example, the Supreme Court ruling on the side of Virginia, upholding their ability to remove voters from rolls less than 90 days out from Election Day based off of DMV data that would suggest that they are not citizens and therefore cannot vote. Federal law does dictate that 90-day period does exist. So what do you make of that ruling, the decision by the court?
Frankly, was a ruling that was contrary to federal law. There's a unmistakable federal statute that says you can't make changes like this, systematic purges of voter rolls this close to an election. And the Supreme Court's action seems to go directly contrary to that. It also wasn't a reasoned and argued decision. This was what's on the Supreme Court's so-called shadow docket. It's Halloween. Lots of things are spooky. Shadows are out there that are scary. And let me tell you, the shadow docket of the Supreme Court can be scary. And that certainly is a decision that, seems to have no basis in federal law. And it really could result in some voters in Virginia who have the right to vote, who have the right to have their voices heard in this election, not being able to cast their votes. And that's un-American. And, people of all parties from all places should be opposed to that. We should all be able to have our voices heard. And, it's already unlawful for non-citizens to vote. We know that this is not a widespread problem. And so, it does seem like this is just an attempt to get some voices, prevent them from having their voices heard at the ballot box because some people want to gain power, whatever the cost, even if the cost is to American democracy.
Well, of course, the deadline to have your voice heard at the ballot box is Tuesday. The election will happen. We aren't, though, expecting necessarily the election to be settled in even the 24 hours after that necessarily. And earlier this month, we caught up with Joe Trippi, now at the Lincoln Project. He ran Howard Dean's presidential campaign, and this was his prediction for how long this could all take. Take a listen.
I think this thing could go on for days after the election. It doesn't mean that it won't be questioned, that doubt won't be out there, that legal challenges will happen, that Trump will not agree that he lost if he did, and we'll see how that all plays out. But no, I think the 76 days between November 5th through January 20th, the inauguration day, may be just as important as what happens on election night.
So obviously, Elizabeth, there's a number of things that need to happen in that 76-day period. On December 17th, the actual electors of the electoral colleges will meet at their state capitals. They will cast their votes. Those go to Congress. They're supposed to certify them on January 6th. Then ultimately the inauguration happens 2 weeks later. If there are a ton of legal challenges casting doubt on the outcome of these votes and therefore on those electoral votes, is that process potentially going to be delayed? I mean, what's the realistic potential outcome here?
I think, again, looking back to what we saw in 2020, there were, it's kind of here we go again, like what we saw there. But we saw all of these attacks on the process, and the process was borne out to be free and fair. And these hardworking election officials who are people from our community working at the polls, working to make the system work in the way it's supposed to in our democratic republic, you know, they're going to be working really hard, and they're under an unprecedented level of threat this year. And so that job is even harder. There are these kind of preceded claims from Trump-aligned entities and the Trump campaign themselves trying to cast out in advance, you know, I think in case the campaign can't win at the ballot box, to then, you know, try to thwart the will of the people through the legal process. But as we saw in the 2020 election, you know, even when it's under attack, as we've seen, our democratic system, you know, sometimes it takes time, but it's important to get it right. And, you know, I have faith in those election workers that are laboring so hard and are under this unprecedented threat this election cycle, you know, not just harassment, but also violence and fear for their lives. But they're working hard for democracy and to make sure that all the votes are counted. So I think that even if it takes a little bit of time, the focus is on getting it right and making sure that the people's voices are counted correctly. And we've seen that work time and time again. And even though there are these rather widespread attempts by filing these lawsuits, even if they go nowhere, the fact that they've been filed has been used by some to point to questions, to say there are questions about the process. But so it's kind of a circular argument. We file these lawsuits, then we can say there are questions, but then the lawsuits go nowhere, so there actually isn't any there. And we saw that play out already in 2020, and I think it'll most likely be unsuccessful this go-round as well.
All right, Elizabeth Wydra, president of the Constitutional Accountability Center, thank you for joining. And something tells me we're going to have to check in with you again next week and in the weeks to come. Still ahead, we look at how Indian Americans in the critical swing states are becoming a key voting bloc for Democrats. Bloomberg's Simone Foxman will have that story ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Indian Americans kick off their celebration of the Diwali holiday today, but there's another reason to pay attention to this growing demographic ahead of next week's election. Though they make up less than 2% of total population, Indian Americans live in substantial numbers in the key swing states, and Democrats in particular have taken note. Joining me now is Bloomberg equality reporter Simone Foxman for more. Simone, you have a great story about this out on the Bloomberg terminal and online, just showing the sheer numbers and the power this voting group may have in a race that is expected to have incredibly tight margins. Walk us through it.
Yeah, I mean, just look at those numbers, right? 177,000 Indian Americans estimated in Georgia. You look at Pennsylvania, 166,000. Michigan, 129,000. Sure, overall, that's maybe a small piece of the overall voting bloc. But in a race, you know, look at Georgia, that was decided by 12,000 votes last time. These are substantial numbers of people. There are also people who didn't necessarily live in these states before. There's been a lot of migration to large cities, whether it's Atlanta, Philadelphia, broader suburbs, even the exurbs, like where I was to report this story in Forsyth County, Georgia. And they're really much larger communities that, frankly, weren't there even 8 years ago.
Well, so as we consider the outreach to those voters specifically, who's doing it and who exactly are they targeting?
So I went around canvassing with the founder of AAPI Victory Fund. So this is a political action committee really targeted at Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander voters, of which the largest block in those is Indian Americans and South Asians more broadly. And frankly, what they found is it's chiefly Democrats. They don't see a lot of Republicans out there going door to door. And maybe that's a reflection of more broadly copy the Republicans not focusing as much on door-to-door interactions. But Shekhar Narasimhan, who is the founder of this organization, was really stressing to me how important this is, especially people who don't have voting data in this area. And frankly, you know, as I was walking around with them through communities of entirely or nearly entirely South Asian people, the vast majority said they were going to vote or had already voted for Harris.
And what's the driving factor of that? What is the issue that mobilizes this group of voters specifically?
You know, Indian Americans not monolithic, right? They're from an enormous country, various different experiences, and everyone I met stressed this to me. But in places like Georgia, a lot of these Asian Americans, these Indian Americans had maybe lived in northern states with a little bit more liberal laws, and for that reason, reproductive health was very important. Gun safety. About an hour from where I was, there had been a school shooting, the Appalachia High School shooting, and so that was near and dear to their hearts. Also, immigration came up within a lot of my conversations. Indian Americans, this is the second largest population of naturalized immigrants in this country at the moment, only behind Mexican Americans. And frankly, there are a lot of people stuck between the H-1B and green card piece of that immigration process. There's a large population of undocumented Indian immigrants as well, and so immigration really important for them as well.
All right, Bloomberg, Simone Foxman, great reporting. Thank you so much. Coming up, we've just got 5 days to go. We'll take another look at how Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are making their final pushes on the campaign trail. Our political panel is next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
If you have the kinds of across-the-board sweeping tariffs that are being proposed, that really risks sending the economy back into the kind of supply chain disruptions and price spikes and consumer pain that we saw in the pandemic. If you couple that with mass deportations, but also with the kind of very large increases to the debt that are being proposed, that would be quite an inflationary picture. And
Lael Brainard, director of the National Economic Council, earlier this hour on Balance of Power, speaking on some of the proposals we've heard from Donald Trump on the campaign trail. And there's just 5 days of this campaign left to go. So joining me now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is this evening's political panel, Maura Gillespie, founder and principal at Blue Stack Strategies and Republican strategist, alongside Democratic strategist Alvin Jordan. Welcome to you both. We are in the home stretch here. And I do have the question, Alvin, as we see more crisscrossing of the swing states today, specifically the Sun Belt for both Harris and Trump in states like Nevada. If at this stage of the game it's still trying to convince people that their policies are better, or just convince people to get off the couch and go vote?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. I don't see any of the arguments, whether they be at rallies or, interviews, however you want to lay it out. I don't think that they're convincing anyone at this point, but I do think that they are, kind of stark reminders to get up and vote, maybe early vote, depending on where you are in your circumstance. But I don't think new voters are turning out for candidates based on anything that's been said the last few days.
Well, if we consider the kind of things that have been said the last few days, Maura, it's been a bit of a doozy, from the garbage Puerto Rican island that a comedian was talking about at Madison Square Garden at a Trump rally, to then Joe Biden talking about Trump supporters being garbage. Questions around the treatment of women, as Donald Trump suggests that he wants to protect women whether they like it or not. But then Mark Cuban, a Harris surrogate, says that Trump doesn't surround himself with any strong, intelligent women who have many of his female supporters up in arms. It's been a lot, and I just wonder if any of it makes a difference, or all of this nets each other out because everybody already has their opinions formed for the most part.
It's pretty exhausting when you line it up just like you did there.
Yeah.
And I think for those voters who are just so ready for this to be over, but are just so ready to say, enough, because the hypocrisy, the failure to be objective, it is stark. And it really is. It's frustrating to sit and say, OK, one side can feign outrage over this comment, but then have nothing to say when the president says it. It's just really frustrating. Or the former president says this, and now they're all outraged over X, Y, Z. So it just really, I think at this point, it is about turnout, as Alvin said, and that's the biggest thing that people can focus on, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party down ballot as well, trying to get people to still participate, even though they may be exhausted with what's happening at the top of the tickets. So that's going to be the biggest factor. And I think that we as voters, if we're frustrated with what's happening right now and we don't like either choice, we need to do better in the primaries. We need to be more involved. And I'm glad, I want to see more voter turnout for this election, but I also want people to turn out for primaries moving forward.
Well, that's an excellent point, and we'll be in a primary cycle probably before we know it, as we've gotten here up against the election day, or election week rather, before we've known it. Alvin, Maura, though, was alluding to there that people may have dissatisfaction with their choices at the presidential level, but there's a whole other host of selections they got to make down the ballot. Do you expect we'll see serious ticket splitting in this election?
I do, just because of the kind of indecisive nature of the top of the ballot, as far as whether you support the former president and his policies, or perhaps you are going out unequivocally for Harris, but given where you live, maybe there is a Senate race, for instance, if you're in Ohio or Texas or Montana, that maybe has more impact on you personally than some of the federal elections. And so I think maybe in numbers that we haven't seen, the split ticket voting is something that we should for sure keep an eye on.
Well, we were talking about the down ballot races out there yesterday on Balance of Power with Republican Congressman Chuck Fleischmann of Tennessee. And here is what he predicted the outcome will be for the majorities in both the House and Senate.
The United States Senate unequivocally will become Republican, 2 seats minimum, probably 4 or 5. Now the nail biter, candidly, that really affects me, because as chairman of the Energy and Water Subcommittee on Appropriations, that chairmanship rests on us maintaining control in the United States House of Representatives. That will be, candidly, I think, a closer race. I feel better day by day, but it's going to be a close one.
So some candor there, Maura. You, of course, spent a lot of years working in the House. How do you think it's going to go in terms of who gets the majority?
Sure. I think it's going to be very close in the House. I'm hopeful, that Speaker Mike Johnson can hold on to the gavel and maybe, build that majority a little bit. But I think at this point, the Senate does feel pretty solid going Republican. And I think that's also reflective in some of these races like Ohio, like Pennsylvania, where the candidates are really saying, I have supported policies on both sides. Sherrod Brown in Ohio is saying he's for Ohio, and that he has agreed with policies that Donald Trump had during his presidency. He agrees with policies on the left. So they're trying to play very strictly down the middle. And I think that's reflective of the fact that things are looking like Senate will take over Republicans will take over the Senate. But for the House, it really does feel as though most things have now formed into toss-up seats based on polling, but probably also with dissatisfaction at the top. Because I do, as Alvin said, split ticketing is going to be one of the biggest things we're going to see, I think, this year, that we haven't seen in years past.
But Alvin, do you really think we could see split ticketing to the extent that the House could stay Republican and Harris could win the presidency? Is it likely that those two things happen, or vice versa?
Yeah, likely, I'm not sure, but I do think that there's a shot of it, just based on, to Mara's point, we are seeing a lot of, for lack of a better term, wishy-washiness on the issues that a lot of these candidates are supporting. And I think that at the top, it will be split enough for where some of these to surprise us. And I think we could look for what some might call upsets in certain areas, just solely based off of the fact that the ballots will be split.
Finally, in our final moments here, as we consider these final days on the campaign trail. Oh, Maura, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'd also say that there are people who may not vote for Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, and they'll vote for a write-in. And then maybe they'll choose, a Democrat in Ohio or a Republican in their House seat. It is possible, and I think this election is so not something like we've seen before that we shouldn't, it's definitely possible. Something to consider.
Okay, well, now we have 90 seconds left. So quickly, in these final 5 days, Maura and Alvin, Maura, I'll come to you first. What is the one thing the candidates need to be messaging on the trail?
Get out and vote, even no matter what. Get out and vote. Get out and vote. Get out and vote.
Alvin?
For sure, turnout, and I think transparency as it relates to the process, just to kind of quiet maybe some of those rumblings, will be important also.
The rumblings I'm assuming you're referring to are already Trump suggesting, for example, there's cheating in Pennsylvania. What does that signal to you?
It signals that the playbook perhaps worked before and that it's worth visiting again. I think if more people can be up in arms, I think that helps if there are any questions, quote unquote, about the turnout of the election next week for sure.
All right, Alvin Jordan and Maura Gillespie, our wonderful political panel this evening. Thank you both so much for joining me. And of course, for more coverage of this election, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online, and come back here for Balance of Power tomorrow. It's going to be a big day. We'll get the final jobs report before this election. 105,000 additions, or now 100,000. The number has gone lower as what's expected on non-farm payrolls. Could be pretty telling of how this economy is faring heading in to this big vote. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.